Welcome to Mooney Reads. Today I'm going to be doing my wrap-up for September and October. And yes, I am in the same outfit as my last video because it is the same day. So, first I'll talk about what I read in September. The readathons going on during this were Shorty September and Sapphic September. And part of the way through the month, Latinx Book Bingo also started on the 15th. Over the course of September, I read 6 nonfiction books and 5 fiction books. 3 of these were library books. And then I have 2 that were audiobooks that were also from the library. But one of the audiobooks I already owned, and then the other one I also bought. So that's kind of like a complicated sort of situation, but I did use the library a lot. I started off Shorty September with a couple of super short shorties with a couple of zines. The first being On Order by Peter Kropotkin in this small zine format. This is an essay looking at early anarchism and where the name anarchism came from, and kind of the fact that it didn't kind of originate with the people who were the anarchists and sort of that development. And it gave some insight on what it was like to be a peasant in Russia at this time, and kind of where these ideas originated from. It was pretty cool. I also read Making Spaces Safer by Shawna Porter, which has apparently been developed into a book, but I read the zine that came out first, and that did have some good stuff in it. Some of it was good review for bystander intervention training that I've done before. There were pieces of it that were really good, and then there were pieces of it that were just kind of missing in some ways, especially when they were talking about calling the police. I don't think that they did a well enough job kind of talking about that. So, I think I gave it a 3.5. After that, I read The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson, which is one of those that I really liked parts of it a lot, so it made the parts that were less good kind of a little bit more intense, or I maybe had more thoughts on it than I might have if it had just been kind of okay overall. So I really liked the way that it was written, and I thought that the topics that they focused on were really interesting. There were some parts that were kind of muddled though, and a couple of sort of off comments, which could be partly attributed to the fact that it's a little older. However, overall it was good. I gave it 4 stars. I definitely see why people like it a lot. After that, I read the best book of the month, and definitely a contender for my top this year, which was On Call by June Jordan. This is a political essay collection, and she talks about a lot of different topics, a lot of different places, including things from her own life. I really loved that she was able to cover so much ground, and just the things that she had to say were so profound, like the fact that there was kind of these memoir elements, and looking at kind of your own experiences with that political lens, especially such intense personal experiences, like the death of her mother. It was just really amazing overall, and I'm glad I finally got to read this. I've seen some of her poetry here and there, but I don't think ever read an essay of hers. And I will say, unfortunately, On Call is really hard to get. My partner has a copy, which is why I was able to read it, but trying to find it online is kind of ridiculous. However, the cover photo of it on Storygraph is the table of contents, and some of the essays you can just find if you Google the essay name June Jordan in PDF. So I would recommend doing that. After that, I read Mamo by Sas Millege, which is a graphic novel that was really cute. It focuses on this hedge witch and a girl from this town, and the girl is trying to help her mom, who is sick, and the witch kind of begrudgingly helps her because she's not like really wanting to stay in town anymore, but they end up going on this really long adventure. It's super cute. The art is really comfy, and it's gay, which I didn't even know when I picked it up. So that ended up being good for Sapphic September as well as Shorty September. Everything I read thus far was for Shorty September. Actually, I think everything I read this month was a Shorty. So next, I listened to Against Technoablism by Ashley Shaw, and this was about ableism, obviously, but also specifically how it intersects with technology. So this is looking at adaptive technologies, their faults, but also like the stories that we get told about adaptive technology that is inconsistent with lived experiences of disabled people. But also the fact that adaptive technology is seen as a way to fix them by some people, including and especially the people who market and in some cases create this technology. So it's kind of looking at these sorts of issues, but also kind of moving further and thinking about different disabilities could be like a benefit in some cases with certain technologies. So it does a lot for such a little book, and it was so good that I had to get my own copy. After that, I read Empathy by Sarah Schulman, and I am really enjoying going through Sarah Schulman's early 90s books. I read Rat Bohemia before, so I think this was my second one, and this one is even more like surreal in some ways. So we're following two characters. One of them is a lesbian who's kind of dealing with a kind of intense breakup, and she keeps falling in love with these people who end up wanting to live as straight women. So she has kind of an issue with that, on top of like the world feeling like it's going to shit because it's the like in the throes of the AIDS epidemic. Then you have this other character who is a like street corner psychologist that's not and he doesn't have a degree, but his parents were Freudians and he just talks to people. So it's kind of these two people's lives. And I can't really say much more than that because some interesting things end up happening, but it's very character focused. I love books where nothing happens and it's just about characters, but I know if that's not your thing, you won't like this, but I thought it was really interesting. After that, I read Frontera, which is a graphic novel. This one also went for Latinx book bingo. And this is about a boy who is crossing the border into the United States and his journey with that. He encounters a ghost who helps him along the way. And it talks about a lot of things with surprising complexity for a young adult graphic novel. So things around immigration, issues of ICE and the Border Patrol, not just official Border Patrol, but like vigilante weirdos. So that was very, very good, very well done. Also great art. And then after that, I read The Undocumented Americans, which is another contender for my favorite. I had started reading this several years ago. I had a copy of it, and just in the little bit that I started reading, I loved how she approached this. It's written by someone who grew up undocumented, and she's interviewing undocumented people in different cities. So you're getting to have a really intense insight into what it was like in post 9/11 New York, and in places like Flint, Michigan. And so each of these places has like their own specific things going on, but there's a lot of overlapping problems. But she's very open about her own kind of experiences with these things, and you're also getting to see how she interacts with these other people and the kind of relationships that she forms. So it's not just, you know, kind of journalism, interviewing people, and you know, any random person that didn't have these connections that she does have wouldn't have been able to interview these people, because why would they trust them, you know, among other things. But it was really well written, and it was just really great. I ended up setting it down initially just because, like, sometimes I just set shit down for no real reason. Sometimes I'll, like, overhype things in a certain way. But I picked up the audiobook, listened to it in like a day, and it was really awesome. And The Undocumented Americans is another one that I did not pick up knowing that it was queer at all, but the author is queer and mentions that in there, so that's really cool. So it was another one for Sapphic September. Then after that, I read Fangs by Sarah Anderson, which is a graphic novel. It's about a vampire and a werewolf who fall in love. It's really cute. It kind of reads more like something that was put out weekly or something like that. It was like small little bits and bobs that are, there's kind of sort of a through line plot. But you know, it's mostly just like vibes, and it's cute. So it was a nice little moment. And then the last book that I read in September was my least favorite, unfortunately, and that was Bloom by Deliah S. Dawson. I bought this book thinking that it would be like a cool, kind of like weird horror, and I guess it was those things, but the thing is, I like the concept. This main character meets this girl who sells food at the farmer's market, and they start flirting. This person has this food that's like just really freaking incredible, but she's super secretive, or like, you know, she's not on social media at all. She's very particular about where she wants to meet, so she's kind of like mysterious. And I don't really want to say too much because that would spoil the story, but I feel like there were parts of the story that could have been deeper and interesting that were kind of just short of that. And the even bigger issue that I had was with the writing itself, because there were parts of it that were so like beautifully and richly written, and it would reiterate the character's emotions or reiterate a fact and say something like cheesy. So it would just take something really beautiful and nice and like cheapen it in a way, or like, I don't know, it stated the obvious in places that you really didn't need to, and it kind of made the experience a lot worse for me, so I didn't like that. So that brings us to October. And I think the only real readathon that I did in October was finishing the rest of Latinx Book Bingo, because it ran from 15 September to 15 October. And I only read one nonfiction book this month, which is wild because I've been reading just a shit ton of nonfiction, but I needed a little break, I guess. So I read 4 fiction books. I can't read my own handwriting. And during the course of the month, I read 3 library books, 2 of which were on audio. So I started out super strong with an amazing audiobook, Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo, which I read for Latinx Book Bingo, as well as Read Queer All Year, which is, I guess, the other, it's an ongoing readathon, so I forget to mention it sometimes. You probably know what Clap When You Land is. I feel like I'm the last person to have read it. But it's about 2 half-sisters. One of them lives in the Dominican Republic, and then the other one lives in New York. They don't know about each other, but their dad goes back and forth. And then they find out about each other after he dies. And I really love the way that it was written and a lot of the nuances in there about family and grief. It was just a really great reading experience, and I really loved it. After that, I read Plain Jane and the Mermaid, which was cute. It's a YA graphic novel that I borrowed from the library, read it in like a sitting. And I didn't know too much going into it other than basically just what was on the front cover. This is set in, I think I don't know, like the 1800s. It wasn't very specific, but it's about this little girl whose parents die, and they're very well off, but her uncle or other relative is the person who gets everything because she is an unwed woman. So she wants to go find a husband so that she doesn't become homeless, basically. But in going to talk to really the only boy in town that she really has an interest in at all, she ends up going off on this underwater adventure. So there are mermaids, there's a selkie, and while there's this interesting little adventure with these characters, and it's talking about the history of, you know, sexism and that sort of legacy, but it also focuses a lot on body image, because one of the things about this character is that she is constantly told by her parents and everyone else how plain or ugly she is, and that she's like fat, or, you know, all of these different things. And so that's also one of the things that's tackled throughout the course of the story. So I thought that was a really good message, and it was a really cute story. After that, I finished Send My Roots Rain by Ibis Gomez-Vega for Latinx Book Bingo, and I had originally started reading it in September, so it would have also been good for Sapphic September. But this is a backlist lesbian book set in a Texas border town. The main character drives from, I don't know if it was New York, but somewhere close to there, to take up this painting job. She's gonna paint this cathedral that's going to be built, but when she gets there, you know, she's not even sure she really wants to, but then also the church isn't even built yet, and she starts learning more about the townspeople and their drama and stuff. But in learning about all of these characters, we're also learning about the main character and kind of some of the issues that she has. She's dealing with the grief of her mother, and also these questions about her own identity, because she kind of knows part of where her mother's from. Her mom was from Spain, and was Jewish in Spain and moved to the United States. And then her dad was from kind of assumably Mexico, but never talked about it or wanted to acknowledge it. And she was there with these other people who all come from different places, and that's a very kind of important part of the dynamics, because you have a couple of people who came from other Latin American countries from various really awful situations, and then you have the preacher who is Spanish. He's like a Spaniard who came in basically just to the phrase my brain is coming up with is to talk Jesus with, and that is not right. But basically, he's just there to preach to them. And there's also some additional conflict, because one of the women who is indigenous to the area, he thinks is a witch, but she's still practicing Catholicism, but it's kind of mixed in with some like mysticism, and she's a medicine woman. So there's a lot of really interesting things going on and a lot of neat dynamics. It's another one where I think this does have a plot, but it's very much more about the characters. And it's also written in a really interesting way. So we go back and forth to different perspectives to a certain extent, but the only person who gets the first person perspective is the main character. And then when we're looking into the other characters, it's third person limited, with a couple of exceptions throughout the book, where there are small pieces with the main character in third person limited. So I think that's a really interesting choice, and it definitely makes you think about the characters in different ways. I could definitely see that as like something that some people would really want to know, because I know people have lots of opinions about third and first person, or would hate that jump. I don't particularly have super strong feelings about reading first person versus third person. However, I do think like meshing them and doing it in multiple ways definitely makes you more aware of perspective, which I think is really beneficial with the way that the story is. Then we finally get to the nonfiction book that I read this month. I listened to the audiobook of They Called Me a Lioness by Ahed Tamimi. And she was taken and imprisoned by Israel when she was 16. She goes through and talks about her story and basically what it was like growing up in her town, which was had a heavy presence of Israeli soldiers and had a lot of people who were fighting back. They would regularly have protests. So their area was highly targeted. She had a lot of family members and friends who were killed or maimed by the Israeli soldiers. And I think this is a really big one to pick up, to kind of understand the situation that Palestinians are in, the complete power imbalance, as well as just the intensity of that presence and what it's like to be in a place colonized like that, especially with the kind of like apartheid that they have happening. And this was published well before October 7th of last year, so this is definitely a picture of what it's been like, and also I think really points also at the influence of media attention, because the only reason she was picked on, it seems, or really called out, it had way less to do with the actual what happened and way more to do with the fact that it was caught on camera and the kind of negative press that they ended up getting from it. So she was taken into custody way after the fact. So this was really immersive and well written and gives you a very, I think, clear picture of what it's like living there. The next book I read was People in Trouble by Sarah Schulman. So kind of going back, I read Empathy the month before. I had read Rat Bohemia, and People in Trouble actually came first, and I could definitely see elements of both Rat Bohemia and Empathy. I'll say People in Trouble is definitely still very people focused, but it does have a little bit more of a plot than the other two, and while there is definitely there are definitely elements of surrealism, but I think it is like less than some of the other two. But this is about really there are three POV characters. It switches back and forth. There is a couple who have been married, and then the woman of the couple is having a relationship with as well. So it's looking at their dynamic and their kind of individual issues, but it's also, as with all of Sarah Schulman's other the other two, it's looking at living in New York during the AIDS crisis. So it's looking heavily at obviously AIDS, and I think this is actually more directly talks about like the activism that is happening. You're actually going to, like, I don't think they say ACT UP in the book, but it's ACT UP meetings and protests, more in the latter half of the book, but throughout the whole book, and also I don't think I mentioned this, but it's featured very heavily in Empathy, and it was also in Rat Bohemia, looking at the homeless problem and the drug issues that were happening at the same time as well. That is very palpable through all three of her novels that I've read. So this is another one that's very character centric, and I think that she's able to look at them each in a very interesting way. Like the narrative definitely tells you a lot about the characters. And I feel like I can't really say that much more without spoilers. But I will say that it's very interesting. I'm also interested to see what Sarah Schulman has to say in the nonfiction book that she wrote a little while after this. I learned after reading this that apparently a lot of people see this as heavy inspiration for Rent. And I can definitely see it, but I'm curious to see kind of what she says, or kind of how upset she was at that, because that's, La Vie Boheme, or that original opera is obviously like overtly referenced, but this book is most definitely not. So that'll be interesting to read more about. That was my last book. I'm almost out of space and my phone's about to die. So that is all I have for today. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of these. And thank you all so much for watching. Bye.